right, guys, welcome back to another fantastic episode of How Do I Pass My Star Test?
Yeah, this is big brain time.
All right, today we're talking about domain and range. So, if you guys remember, domain is all of your x values. And what does that mean? If we're looking at a graph, that means that we're talking about everything from the left to the right, everything from side to side, horizontal, which means you probably guessed it, your range is all of your y values. Now, this time, if you're looking for the range, you're looking from everything from the bottom to the top, up and down. So let's start with this graph right here. Now, when you see dots on the graph, this is what is known as a discrete function.
Oh, yeah. It's all coming together.
All right, so what you're going to look for, the domain first. Remember, this is our x values, so everything from the left side to the right side. So if I look at these dots and I'm looking for my domain, just go step by step. Look at this dot right here. Find the x value by going up to the x-axis. I see that x value right there is -1. I go to the next dot. I'm going to go down this time because it's above the x-axis, but I'm still going to the same axis, and I see it's at +1. Last up, my third dot, I see that I have a dot at the x value of 2, and that is the x value there. Now, when I jump over to the range, I'm going to do the exact same thing, but you guys probably already guessed it. I'm looking for the y value this time. So I'm going to look at the same dot, but instead of going up to the x, I'm going over to the y. Well, it just so happens in this case that y value there is also -1. When I go to the next dot up here, it's not quite at 4, so let's go ahead and call it a decimal. So right here, let's call that 3.8. And last up, there was only 3 dots. So what is the y value of this last dot? Again, going to the y-axis, and I see that this dot right here has a y value of 1. Now, the biggest thing to remember here, when you're trying to find these values, just always remember your x-axis is your horizontal axis. When I'm finding those numbers, you're going to draw a line either up or down to get to it because you're trying to touch this axis. If I'm looking for the range, I'm doing the same strategy, but instead of going up or down, I'm going either left or right to try to hit this up and down axis. All right, so let's clear this out, and now let's take a look at what we're probably most likely to see on your STAR test questions. So this is a discrete function. That's just when we're going to list out straight up what is our x values, what are all of our y values. However, most of the time you're going to probably see this. We're going to write the domain and the range in inequality notation. So I've looked in this. I have this parabola-shaped graph, but you'll also notice the dots. So remember, if it's an empty circle, that means we don't have it. It's empty. We do not add the line underneath. However, if it is solid, we do have it, so we add that or equal to line underneath our inequality. So starting with the domain, remember, domain is my x value. So I'm looking for everything from left to right. So when I look at this graph, I'm trying to figure out, okay, there's my x-axis. Where's the furthest I go to the left? And right here, I can see that I start right at 0. Now, the cool thing about inequality notation is that for the most part, these inequalities are always going to go the same direction. So, like I just said, 0 is the furthest I go to the left. So guess what that means? 0 is my smallest number. So all of my x's are definitely greater than 0. And guess what? It was a solid dot, so it's greater than or equal to 0. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing, but going from the left to the right. So if I follow this, the biggest x value I have is right here at 10. So I know that all of my x values are also smaller than 10. Now I'm going to check. Do I add the line here? Well, it was an empty circle. Empty circle means we don't include it. So I just have everything less than 10, but not including 10. So right there, that is how I'm going to write my domain for this particular graph. Now let's jump over to the range. Now remember, domain was left to right. Range is everything from bottom to top. Now the range can sometimes get a little tricky. So when I'm looking at this, the lowest value is obvious. If I'm looking at this, obviously the bottom value is down here. And again, that value is going to be at 0. So I have everything less than 0. And I got ahead of myself there. You saw me about to draw that line. Now, there's an empty dot here, but there's a solid dot here. Now, if you're at the same spot and one of them is solid, that means that's the one that's going to take over. So, yes, I am going to add the line underneath the inequality there. So, all of my y's are everything bigger than or equal to 0. Now, I'm going from bottom to top. So that doesn't mean I go from this dot to the last dot. I need to go from the lowest dot to the tallest dot. And in this case, when I look at that, it shows me that my tallest y value was 25. And again, I see a solid dot there, so guess what that means? I'm going to draw my inequality, and when I do that, I'm going to add the line to it. So my range, I have everything greater than or equal to 0, and everything less than or equal to 25. Just again, a reminder, domain is always the x's, range is always the y's. All right, let's take a look at another one. So this is going to be the same basic concept, but now we're adding in the arrow. So the easiest way to think about this is that a dot means that we stop, an arrow means that we keep going forever. Okay, so starting with the domain, again, this is my x value. Now, if we look at this, the furthest thing that happens is actually on the right. We have an x value of 6. So I'm going to say x and 6. When there's only one dot, I'm only going to include one number. Now we've got to figure out what symbol is going to go right here. Well, are my x values getting smaller or are they getting bigger? Remember, I'm only talking about left to right. Well, if my arrow is going to the left, even though I see that we're going from 4 to 6 to 8, those numbers are technically getting bigger. Since we're getting more negative, the numbers are actually getting smaller. So what am I going to say here? X is everything less than positive 6. And again, I'm not going to include the line because we had an empty circle there. So straight up, x is less than 6. Now let's try the range. Starting with y, of course, because we're talking about the range. We're only going to include one number. But again, this is where you got to be careful. I'm not looking at the dot. I need to know where's the lowest value. So looking at this graph, if I follow it, where's the lowest point that we get to? And that is going to be right here, which if I find the y value for that, that is going to be negative 3. Now the last up, just like we did here, I got to figure out what symbol is going to go here. Do I have everything bigger than negative 3 or smaller? Well, you can tell from this point, this was the bottom of something. So from here, all we can do is go up. And since this arrow right here, this means that we go up forever. We have a range of everything greater than negative 3. Now we got to figure out, does a line go here? Now, I do not see a dot here, but your rule of thumb is unless you see one of these empty circles, you're going to treat that like it's a solid dot. So yes, this one is also going to get the line. So our range is all of our y values greater than or equal to negative 3. All right, the last thing, you guys were probably wondering when I was going to talk about it. All real numbers. So last time we only had one arrow in the graph. This time we're going to have 2. And there's going to be different combinations that we can do for this. So we've gone over 3 functions in this class. Linear, which makes straight lines. Quadratic, that makes parabolas. And exponential, that make these steeper and steeper graphs, whether it's growth or decay. Now for each of these, you're going to have special cases going on. Linear is probably the easiest one to remember because guess what's going on? We're going left and right forever. We are going up and down for forever. So both your domain and your range are both all real numbers. And I'm just going to say ARN for short here so I don't run out of room. And again, both the domain and the range are all real numbers. Now let's look at the quadratic the quadratic function. This is going to make the U shape. And again, we have 2 arrows, but only one of these is going to be all real numbers. And in this case, it's going to be the domain. The reason that is look what's happening. On the left side, we have an arrow. We go to the left forever. On the right side, we have another arrow. So we go to the right forever. So my domain is all real numbers. However, the range, this goes from the bottom here. Let's go ahead and call this -1. Now, just like we said earlier, unless you see an empty circle, we're going to consider this a solid one. And we're going up from that point. So my range is going to be y is greater than or equal to -1. The most important part about this is that quadratic functions, they have a domain of all real numbers, but the range is only focused on where is the top or the bottom of the parabola shape that you see. All right, last up, we have these exponentials, the ones that just get steeper and steeper. Once again, we have an arrow going left and right, which means our domain is all real numbers. So when in doubt, if you're asked what the domain is and you see two arrows, you're more likely than not to see all real numbers. But you'll notice the range has been changing. For linear functions, yes, we got to say they were all real numbers again. For quadratics, they had to change. We had to say greater than or equal to wherever the bottom was. For exponentials, this is one that's very important to remember. Remember, the exponentials have an asymptote. This graph never crosses the x-axis. It never touches it. So what you're going to say in this case is we have our y values are greater than 0. And we are not going to include a line because remember, it's an asymptote. It will never touch that value. All right, so what I want you guys to do is you're going to answer these following questions on your own. Answer them in the computer and see if you guys can come up with the right answer. All right, guys, so I hope this lesson helped. When you're ready, move on to the next station.